I sighed as I took in the destruction in the shed. It had been like this all week, and I was getting a little tired of it. Something had been breaking into our sheds and chicken pens, and I was at a loss to determine what it was. It was big, but it was also smart, and neither doors nor windows seemed to bother it much. It ate meat, as the 4 new chickens we had bought could attest, and grain, as our ripped open sacks of fish feed and chicken feed could attest. I had wondered if it might be a young bear cub, but Grandpa thought it might be a fox, given its craftiness. "Any luck, boy?" he asked, stumbling up beside me with a leathery smile. "Nothing yet. I tell you, Gramps, this thing is tricky." When I had replaced the twist of metal on the chicken coop with a hook lock, it had gotten around it. When I replaced the hook lock with a crossbar on the shed, it had gotten around that too, coming in through a window. Whatever this thing was, it was smarter than your average possum, and I was beginning to wonder what exactly I was dealing with. "Maybe it's the little people," Grandpa said, smiling as he said it. "What, like the fairies you throw bottles for?" "Not quite. More like the ones I met in Alaska. They could just walk in and out of places, and they were wicked smart, too." I opened the door on the varmint trap and wrinkled my nose as I pulled out the bait that Lenny had given me at the trading post. It smelled like old cheese and bad blood, but he said it would attract all kinds of things. Most scavengers couldn't resist it, and even some of the larger predators would find it tasty. I made sure to sprinkle some corn around it, and even set some of the mutilated chicken carcass in there as well, just for good measure. "Sounds like quite a tale. Wanna tell me about it?" It was coming on dark now, the sunset making the sky glow a deep red, and Grandpa nodded as he set off for the house. As the darkness fell, we sat around the kitchen table, drinking cold beers as Grandpa reminisced. "It all started with a briefing from the base colonel and a strange report from some lookouts. We had assembled my unit, what was left of it, and we were about 20 in all. We had some new blood come in, raw recruits, most of them, but there was talk that they meant to send us to the front line. They were starting to push back against the Nazis, and they needed just about every hand to make it happen. The problem was that we weren't in Alaska to stop the Germans. We were in Alaska to stop the Russians. The United States military had decided that Russia might decide to swoop in after the war and take back the rich oil deposits in Alaska, or that the Japanese would come in and beat them to it if the war went south for us. They also had some suspicions that the native population were working with the Russians and meant to turn on us. It was all malarkey, though. John said there were a lot of stories about how the Ruskies were worse than we were to the natives, and that any notion that they would welcome them back was preposterous. The fact of the matter is, the Russians subjugated us harshly, splitting up families and using children and wives as leverage against tribal attacks. The United States hasn't treated us much better in the past, but currently we're mostly ignored and tolerated. This is considered progress." It didn't sound so great to me, and he said it with a sad smile that let me know he was practicing his gallows humor. Anyway, I've gone off trail. The reason for the meeting was some of our lookouts had seen something strange on a nearby island, a little patch of land called Kepchke. Now, Kepchke was little more than 20 miles from the center in all directions. They had a little population of elk and lots of native birds nested there in the warm months. The fishing around the island was supposed to be particularly choice, but the natives did not, as a rule, go to the island. John wouldn't say why, but I suspected it had something to do with cultural superstition, like the woods near town. The island had trees on it, and fresh water, probably other resources, but the army was concerned that the Reds or the Japanese might be using it as a listening post. Our lookouts have seen what They might call people moving around on the island. Intel says it's nothing definitive, no confirmed sightings, but the lookout guys think it might be humanoid in appearance. Humanoid in appearance was something the lookouts used to describe a lot of stuff. Small bears, monkeys, hell, even large otters, so I've been told, have fallen under humanoid in appearance. It's ass-covering language, to be sure, but you get a glimpse of something, and it might be nothing, but in case it's something, you call it in anyway. The colonel was putting together a small team to go out and investigate, and I was selected for it. John was asked to go as well, the brass thinking his knowledge of the area might be useful, and they put about 6 of the recruits under us to back us up. John and I had a reputation for handling ourselves, and I think when we found those boys and brought John's nephew back from the woods, it went a long way to speaking for our character. So they piled 8 of us into a pontoon boat, and away we went for Kepchke. The waters were pretty fair that day, and as we rowed, I asked John why his people didn't take advantage of the island's resources. A place like that in Appalachia would have been hunted, clear-cut, and settled for sure. John looked like he didn't want to say, but he trusted me and finally came out with it. Legend says that the island is home to the Rinrat, he finally said, keeping his voice low. He had to repeat it for me a couple of times, and I told him it was a bit of a mouthful. They're little people, not of our world, but similar. They're said to be able to step in and out of our world, and they like to hunt and gather as we do. They had been sighted on the island before, but they don't like to be disturbed. If we see them, we should leave. They aren't hostile, but they don't like being disturbed, and they can turn violent. We have something similar back home. Grandma always told me not to encroach on fairyland, and your Ringrat sound a lot like them. We came to the shore then, and as we stepped off, I left 4 of them to make camp as we slunk into the bush. The trees were little more like the firs I had back home, and the ground was carpeted with needles and limbs. The ground was stony, but the soil was rich and brown. It felt moist as I took a handful of it to test, and I figured there might be bushes that had nuts or fruit somewhere on the island too. It was good soil, and it must have taken a lot of fear to keep the natives from it. We had walked a short way in before I discovered that we weren't the island's first explorers. We were moving slowly, keeping an eye on our surroundings, when John tapped my shoulder and pointed off to the left. "Tent," he whispered, and as I squinted, I did see something that looked like a tent pole jutting up near us. I got the boys in order, and we crunched as quietly as we could towards the potential enemy camp. Well, they were potential enemies, but I doubt they'd be raising many alarms when we happened upon them. We came on a few tents, the poles the only thing left behind, for some fur scraps. No canvas on these puppies, and the metal poles were old and less uniform than the ones the army gave us. Sitting around the remains of what could charitably still be called a fire pit were 3 skeletons, picked clean and grinning. There was a lonely food tin sitting next to 'em, and one had a bottle clutched in his bony fingers as if he needed only to lift it to his disappeared lips. All of 'em grinned merrily as if to invite us to the party, and it was a sobering sight. We checked around, but there was very little to be found. The tin was free of labels or legends, and the bottle was brown like a medicine glass, but bore no signs. The skeletons wore scraps of clothes they had died in, but time had almost eaten these away as well. The tent was no help either. The furs had dissolved, and the metal was just crude poles. They could be American or Russians or Martians for all we knew. It seemed like the cold had killed them. But as the two recruits moved off, John pointed to the ribs of the one holding the bottle. They were chipped, as if something had pierced between two of them. A knife, maybe, I suggested, but John only shrugged. We hit the other side of the island about an hour later, but we wouldn't see anything else until our trip back. We had decided to crisscross the island during the day, not really keen on staying the night after finding the old campsite. We would eat dinner and pack up at sunset, hopefully marching back to the barracks by nightfall. We were coming back towards the boat, maybe 20 minutes from where we had left the others, when we heard something. It was a perfect baritone, sounding like someone singing from the bottom of a well. I called for a stop, and we all got low as I pulled out my binoculars and started looking for the source of the singing. I found it picking up sticks near the juncture of two firs, and it was an odd little creature, to be sure. It was a perfectly normal human, though shrunk to the size of a toddler. I don't mean it was a little person, though that's the closest I can come to describing it. It had a long beard and a thick set of eyebrows. It appeared hairy, though that could have been furs too. There was something on its belt, a knife or a small axe, and it rolled along comfortably as it collected wood. This was a normal day for the creature, something it had done 1,000 times before, and it was no more wary of its surroundings than I would have been in my own woods. The song it sang was deep and old as the hills, its voice like nothing so much as rocks rolling down a mountain. I prepared to tell the boys that we would be going around when the crash of a rifle drowned out John's warning. One of the recruits, Gibbs, I think his name was, had seen it too as he peeked through his rifle scope. He had seen it and probably jumped to the conclusion that it was an enemy. There was a lot of hurtful propaganda about those of Asian descent at the time. This kid probably thought he had stumbled on a Japanese spy. John had seen him a moment too late, his own binoculars trained on the thing, and his shout hadn't come in time. The bullet hit the creature, but it was like shooting a brick wall with a pea shooter. It stumbled, never really losing its footing, and when it turned to look at our position, I knew we were in trouble. It seemed to fall into itself, its body pulling into a stormy hole that it drug close behind it, and I yelled for the rest to run. We took off through the firs, but we were not alone. Gibbs and the other one, I forget his name, were not as adept in the woods as John and I, and it showed. They tripped and stumbled over roots that we missed easily, and when Gibbs cried out in pain, I reached back to catch him. The kid thought he'd twisted his ankle, but I saw the source of his problem. A little arrow was sticking out of his lower leg, and as I offered him a shoulder, I reached down and broke it off. The woods were suddenly full of grunts and growls, little projectiles flying in to stab and prod as we ran for it. He likely hadn't hurt the creature, but it was mad now, and mad goes a long way. John called out, letting us know the beach wasn't very far, and we ran for our lives as the brush crackled under our feet. They had to be at least a dozen, and I could see furry bodies and hairy creatures as they moved about. They gnashed their teeth too big for their childish faces, and I knew now what had stripped those bodies in the clearing. They may not be violent, but scavengers will scavenge, won't they? I tossed a prayer to the man upstairs, hoping for a little luck, and as we came out of the trees, I sighed in relief. We probably looked like explorers at the end of a native film, and the irony of that statement isn't lost on me. We scared the hell out of those kids we'd left at camp, and they looked confused when I told them to get to the boats. They wanted to pack the gear, to grab the supplies, but I told them to grab their rifles and leave everything else. One of them ended up in the boat without his boots, another one leaving his coat behind, but as we shoved off into the water, I expected that the arrows would follow us on our way. Nothing came to the shore, however. Nothing followed us into the water, and as we floated out into the bay, the others asked what had happened. Before Gibbs could start in, I overrode him. We ran up on some polar bear cubs, and the mother wasn't far behind. We barely made it out alive, and it's a wonder that she didn't chase us into the bay. Gibbs gave me a look, but my look was stonier. It told him flatly not to press it, and just to learn that sometimes caution is best. We went back and told the brass about what had happened, and they figured that the bears were what had been seen. The lookouts didn't see anything on the island after that, other than our gear, which they sent a unit back to get later. Gibbs never talked, thankfully, and John and I agreed to never speak of what we had seen there. The old stories were right, and the island was the property of the Irencrat. I opened my mouth to ask a question, but that was when I heard the snap of the trap from the shed. Grandpa and I set out, flashlights bobbing, and found a very angry fox sitting in the cage as he yelped and begged to be let out, in his high and unknowable voice. Grandpa chuckled. Sometimes, though, it's just a crafty fox with too much curiosity for his own good. We'll get Glimmer to set him loose somewhere far from here. No sense killing him for being smart and hungry. We let him stew for the night, Grandpa yawning as he returned to the kitchen table. I stayed in Alaska for quite a while, but the war couldn't last forever. Maybe next time I'll tell you about its end, and how I ended up staying in Alaska for longer than I meant to. Grandpa's yawn was contagious, and I told him that it sounded like a plan, after a big yawn of my own. With the mystery of our food thief solved, it was time for some much-deserved rest. You're still here. I thought you might be. Thanks for joining me for tonight's story. If your insatiable appetite for horror knows no bounds, might I suggest one of our playlists, or one of our previous stories in the archive? There should be one appearing at the end of the story any minute now. And of course, if you're not subscribed, why not go ahead and hit that subscribe button? Maybe hit that notification bell so you don't miss any of the spooky things that we do here. If you prefer your horror a little more analog, you can always pick up one of my books. There's a link below to my latest, and it'll take you to all the great things that I've posted on Amazon. For my book lovers in the audience, I always suggest coming on down to Patreon so you can become part of my ghostly reader tier and get a book anytime I write one, which is usually about twice a year. Speaking of my patrons, let's go ahead and thank them. Thanks to Janet for being our Spooky Skeleton tier contributor, and thanks to Hi Stacy, Winter, Xaronan, Emily Coltsfoot, Stephanie Carrington, Marianne Schuler, Tyler Parker, and Jennifer Damron for being our Ghostly Reader tier contributors. Thanks, everyone. We just couldn't do the show without you. If you're thinking you might like to become one of my patrons, follow the link below to my Patreon. And as always, however you support the show, I appreciate it. Till next time, Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.